The days that followed that fragile moment in the living room, where Mark and Anna sat side by side in their father's armchairs like two children rediscovering a language they forgot, unfolded not in a straight line but in a series of emotional ripples, quiet and wide, touching every corner of the house that once pulsed with Richard's easy laughter and gentle footsteps. And I remember waking the next morning feeling something I hadn't felt since before he died, not peace exactly, not even calm, but a slight loosening around my ribs, as if the grief had shifted from a crushing weight to a heavy blanket I could at least breathe beneath. And I walked into the kitchen where the sunlight filtered through the window in long honey-colored stripes, falling across the old wooden table Richard and I bought when we couldn't afford anything else, the one where he'd burn toast every weekend and pretend it was experimental. And I saw Mark sitting there hunched forward, elbows on the table, staring at nothing in particular, wearing the same clothes from the day before, the same guilt pressed into the lines of his face, and he looked older somehow, not from age but from the sudden, brutal realization of his own fragility. And when he lifted his eyes to mine, there was no CEO there, no empire builder, no legacy chaser, just a boy who had lost his father and didn't know how to exist in a world where Richard Hayes didn't answer the phone with his usual, "Talk to me, kiddo," and he said, "Mom, what do we do now?" In a voice so small it seemed borrowed from a memory, and I didn't know how to answer because the truth was I didn't know either. I didn't know what the next hour looked like, let alone the next year, and for the first time in decades, Mark allowed himself to admit that he didn't have a plan, didn't have a roadmap, didn't have control, and it terrified him. And then Anna came down the stairs barefoot, wrapped in one of Richard's old sweaters that swallowed her frame, the sleeves dangling past her hands, and she looked both exhausted and awake in a way I had never seen her before, her face stripped of the curated expressions she used for cameras and interviews. And when she sat across from Mark, something softened in the air between them, something I hadn't felt in a long time, a thin but unmistakable thread of siblinghood pulling taut and trembling but real. And for a few moments the three of us just sat there in silence, breathing the same shared grief, until Mark reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it face down on the table, a gesture so simple yet so symbolic that even Anna blinked in surprise, and he said, "I'm turning it off today," as if declaring a vow. And Anna slowly reached into the sweater's oversized pocket and set her own phone beside his, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Me too." And for the first time in years, the house wasn't competing with the constant hum of alerts, notifications, and business calls. It was just the three of us, painfully human, forced into stillness by loss, and in that stillness, something started to thaw. Later that morning, Mark asked if he could see Richard's office, the room he used to avoid because he said it smelled like old books and nostalgia. And when we walked down the hallway and pushed open that door, the air seemed to shift as if the room itself exhaled, and everything inside was exactly as Richard had left it. The chess set mid-game where he always waited for someone to finish a match with him, the old leather chair with its cracked armrest, the dusty globe he loved to spin even though he rarely traveled anywhere that wasn't a boardroom or an airport terminal. And Mark stepped inside with a reverence I hadn't seen from him since he was a kid exploring his father's things, and he touched the desk as if touching something sacred, running his fingers along the grooves and scratches, the marks left by years of deadlines and dreams. And then he saw the framed picture sitting in the corner, the one from the camping trip they took when he was 12, where they burned the marshmallows until they were practically charcoal and Richard insisted they tasted better that way. And Mark picked up the photo, swallowing hard as he whispered, "He kept this here," in a tone soaked with disbelief. And I said, "He kept all of you everywhere." And Mark closed his eyes, the grief rolling through him like a wave he couldn't brace against. And I watched my son, the man the world saw as unshakable, bend under the weight of a truth he had ignored for years, that Richard never stopped being his father, even when Mark stopped being a son. Meanwhile, Anna wandered toward the shelves lined with notebooks, Richard's old journals, filled with scribbled ideas, book quotes, half-finished letters, and sometimes entire pages dedicated to describing a sunset or a memory or a conversation he loved. And she ran her fingers along the spines with the kind of tenderness she didn't show to many things, and she pulled one out, flipping through it absent-mindedly until she found a page titled, "Anna, age 9, and she froze, her breath catching as she read Richard's words describing the first time she performed on stage. How she danced with a boldness that didn't match her tiny body, how her eyes sparkled not with confidence but with joy, raw and unfiltered, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks, and she whispered, "He remembered everything," as if it was a secret she had never considered. And I said softly, "Your father carried you with him even when you didn't carry him," and she closed the journal and pressed it to her chest as if holding a piece of her childhood she'd abandoned for newer, shinier worlds that never loved her the way he did. That afternoon, we found ourselves gravitating to the living room, the three of us moving like planets slowly settling into a new orbit, and Mark suddenly said, "Mom, tell us the story," and I didn't understand at first, so he clarified, "The story of you and Dad, the real story, not the version you tell guests, the version you tell yourself," and something inside me warmed unexpectedly because my children, my distant, unreachable, endlessly busy children, wanted to hear about love, wanted to understand the man they had reduced to a symbol of success, and I began speaking not with the polished lines I'd used in anniversaries or speeches but with the raw truth of the girl I used to be, the girl Richard fell in love with when we were both too broke to buy movie tickets and too hopeful to care, and I told them about the night we met at a tiny diner on the corner of Maple and 4th, how he spilled coffee on his tie trying to impress me and then laughed so loudly the entire room stared, and Mark smiled faintly, saying, "That sounds like him," and Anna leaned forward, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes glistening, and I told them about the day he proposed not with a ring but with a paperclip he twisted into a circle because he said, "Real love doesn't wait for jewelry," and I told them about the early years when we lived on takeout noodles and secondhand furniture, the years before the money came, before the empire, before the distance, when all we had was each other and an unshakable belief that love was enough, and as I spoke, I watched my children rediscover their father not as the larger-than-life figure the world worshipped but as the beautifully flawed, endlessly loving man I married, and for the first time since his death, the room felt like it was filling with him again, not his body, not his voice, but his presence, the soft warmth he left behind in every memory. When I finished, Mark wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and said, "I didn't know any of that," and I said gently, "You didn't want to know," and instead of arguing or retreating into defensiveness as he so often did, he bowed his head and whispered, "I'm sorry," and those two words, simple, unadorned, almost fragile, were the beginning of something I had waited years to hear, and then Anna reached over and took his hand, not the influencer offering comfort to a follower, not the polished public figure, but the sister holding onto her brother like she did when they were little and afraid of thunderstorms, and Mark squeezed her hand back, and for a moment, the air between them shimmered with a kind of closeness I thought we'd lost forever. That night, long after the sun had set and the house was painted in the soft blue shadows of evening, Mark asked if he could sleep in the guest room, just for the night, and Anna said she would stay too, and it felt like the past folding back into the present, the house alive again with the soft sounds of footsteps and doors closing, and I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, the quiet no longer suffocating but settling around me like a gentle cloak, and I felt Richard's absence, yes, but I also felt his presence in a way I hadn't since he left, as if he was watching us slowly stitch together the pieces of what he had spent a lifetime trying to build, a family not bound by achievement but by love, and as I drifted to sleep, I whispered into the darkness, "We're trying, my love," believing somehow he could hear me. And the next morning, when I went downstairs, I froze because Mark was standing at the stove, fumbling with the coffee maker, and Anna was burning toast exactly the way Richard used to, and when they looked up, they both laughed softly, not because it was funny but because it felt right, it felt like honoring him, it felt like remembering him not with marble mausoleums or flower arrangements but with the tiny rituals that built our lives, and as we sat together eating that burnt toast, the three of us bathed in the warm morning light, I realized something quietly profound. Healing doesn't happen in grand gestures or dramatic moments, it happens in the everyday choices to stay, to try, to reach across the distance, to remember, and as I watched my children slowly return to themselves, to each other, and to me, I understood that part 2 of this grief wasn't about surviving Richard's death, it was about becoming the people worthy of his love, the love he never stopped giving even in silence. The days that followed those quiet breakfasts of burnt toast and clumsy coffee were not marked by miracles or sudden transformations but by small, barely noticeable shifts, tiny, almost invisible signs that something inside us was slowly reassembling itself, like a cracked vase being held together by the warmth of the hands that refused to let it fall apart. And on the third morning, when I came downstairs and saw Mark standing by the window with his arms crossed, not in the defensive, impenetrable way he used to stand during business meetings, but in a softer, almost contemplative posture, I realized something had changed in him, something subtle yet undeniable, and when he turned to me, his face illuminated by the tender light filtering through the curtains, he said, "Mom, do you think Dad ever regretted stepping back from the company?" In a tone not searching for validation but searching for truth, and I stepped closer, placing my hand over his where it rested on the windowsill, and I said, "Your father didn't step back, Mark, he stepped toward us," and those words sank into him like pebbles dropping into still water, sending ripples through the parts of him that had been hardened by ambition and expectation, and for the first time, I watched my son confront the possibility that his father's version of success was not one he had ever allowed himself to understand, let alone accept. That afternoon, Anna suggested we go through the attic, the place Richard and I had turned into a storage space for decades of unfinished projects, old photographs, broken furniture we swore we'd fix someday, and childhood drawings the kids didn't even remember making. And when we climbed the creaky wooden steps, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of pine from the old beams, something inside me trembled because the attic wasn't just a room, it was a time capsule, a place where Richard's quiet sentimentality lived in boxes and shelves and crates he labeled in handwriting only he could read. And Anna lifted the lid of the first box with the same caution someone might use to open an ancient relic, revealing stacks of Polaroids from summers spent near lakes and forests, where the kids built forts out of branches and Richard tried, and failed, to teach them how to fish without falling asleep on the dock. And as Anna sifted through the photos, her fingers trembling slightly, Mark found a small wooden box tucked beneath an old blanket, the one Richard's mother made him when he was 14, and when he opened it, he froze, because inside were letters, not sent letters, not public letters, but private, handwritten letters addressed to each of the children, letters Richard had written over the years and never given them, letters filled with the things he never had enough time or courage to say out loud, and Mark carefully picked up the one with his name on it. The paper yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly smudged, and without speaking, he sat down on the dusty attic floor and unfolded it, his breath catching as he read the first line. My boy, I hope one day you slow down long enough to see the world the way I see you, brilliant, stubborn, terrified, and absolutely worth every second. And Mark pressed a hand to his mouth, a sound slipping from him that wasn't quite a sob but wasn't anything else either. And Anna looked at her brother with an expression I hadn't seen since they were teenagers, a mixture of concern, affection, and the silent acknowledgement that they were both living through the same storm, even if it soaked them differently. Anna found her letter next, tucked between old theater programs she'd collected when she was 16, back when she believed that applause could fill every hole inside her, and when she opened it, her eyes flickered across the words as though she was afraid to look at them for too long, and she whispered the first line aloud, my sweet girl, you shine so brightly you don't realize how often you blind yourself, and she let out a shuddering exhale, pressing the letter to her chest, tears gathering along her jawline, and she sat beside Mark, leaning her head gently on his shoulder, the two of them holding their father's words as if holding the man himself, and I felt a heaviness in my chest, not the heaviness of grief but the heaviness of love rediscovered, the kind that sits deep and warm and aching. As they read through letter after letter, each one revealing the quiet, overlooked parts of Richard, the parts he never flaunted, never broadcasted, parts he only wrote down in moments alone with his thoughts, I realized something I had never fully understood while he was alive. Richard had always been preparing us for a world without him, not because he expected to leave us early, but because he understood better than any of us that time was a slippery thing, and love, if not spoken, had a way of fading into the spaces between unspoken words. And as I watched Mark and Anna absorb pieces of their father's heart written in ink, something inside me loosened again, another knot untangled. The next morning, Mark approached me with a tentative resolve I hadn't seen in years and asked if I would go with him to the cemetery, not for a ceremony, not for a gesture of closure, but simply to sit, as his son, not as the man he expected me to be, and the honesty in his voice struck me like a warm shock. So we drove in silence through the quiet streets, the world outside washed in soft gray light, and when we arrived, Mark knelt beside Richard's grave, placing the letter he found on the grass, weighted down by a smooth stone he picked up from the car park, and he whispered something I couldn't fully hear, but I knew it wasn't an apology, not this time. It was something deeper, something like acceptance, something like an introduction between the man he used to be and the man he was trying to become. That evening, we gathered in the living room again, without planning it, without discussing it, just drifting toward each other like three tired souls drawn to warmth, and Anna began talking softly about the future, not the glamorous future she once chased with unrelenting hunger, but a tender, softer vision of it, one where she could breathe, where she could live without performing, where she could choose peace over applause. And Mark listened, genuinely listened, offering quiet nods, the kind of nods Richard used to give when he wanted you to know he was fighting the urge to fix your problems so he could just be there with you in them. And as night settled gently around the house, wrapping itself in the memories, the regrets, the hopes, and the fragile new beginnings, I realized part 3 of this story, this journey, wasn't about grief or survival anymore. It was about recognition, about my children finally seeing their father not as the man they expected him to be but as the man he truly was, and in that recognition, they began to see themselves too, not as the fractured adults they had become but as the children Richard had always believed they could return to someday, the children capable of loving deeply, breaking openly, and healing slowly, one breath, one letter, one memory at a time. The days that unfolded after the cemetery visit carried a strange, delicate quiet, not the hollow silence of absence, but the kind that feels like a deep inhale before a long overdue confession. Every morning I found myself waking before the sun, sitting on the edge of the bed Richard and I shared for decades, listening to the soft stirrings of a house rediscovering its heartbeat. One morning, just as the sky softened into a pale watercolor blue, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, as if someone was trying not to disturb the world, and when I stepped out, I saw Mark standing outside Richard's office door, his hand hovering over the knob like a man preparing to open a door to his own childhood. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher until he whispered, "I want to do something, but I don't know if it's the right thing." I walked toward him, placing my hand over his trembling fingers. "If it comes from here," I said, tapping gently over his heart, "it's already right." He breathed a shaky breath before pushing the door open, revealing the room exactly as Richard left it, and Mark stepped inside with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen in him since he was little and determined to build a treehouse that couldn't stay upright for more than 20 minutes. He walked to the desk, pulled out the top drawer, and stared at the unfinished letter Richard had been writing the morning he died, the ink frozen mid-sentence, the pen resting just beside it as if his hand had simply gone to find more words and never returned. Mark picked it up with a reverence that made my throat tighten as he read,